Hello, everyone. Welcome or welcome back. If this is your second time watching our support line YouTube video, I'm Ashley De La Torre. I'm a project manager for Babes Only. I'm also DJ Mami in the night. So I will be here with Bianca on this as the other half of this duo.
Yes, and I'm Bianca Herrera. By day, I guess I'm a case manager at a rape crisis center in Chicago. And by night, I guess I'm a spiritualist and tarot worker known as Bodacious Bruja. So welcome Baya.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking again. Our video themes kind of always cover sexual assault and sexual assault awareness. So we're going to be diving into that a bit deeper today versus our first video. But I wanted to start today with a check-in and just kind of, before we start any of these kind of conversations, I think it's always important to assess where your head is at, where your emotional capacity is at. Me and Bianca are in a completely new space because we've been moving for what feels like ever. And this is probably, I've moved a few times, and this is probably the toughest move I've ever had to do, just because I'm just like, wow, as I get older, I have so much shit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, also, I really liked our last space. It was me and Bianca's first time, like, living together. Yeah. So I'm just like, wow, we're leaving a cool spot for obviously another cool spot, but it's just like, it's just adjustments all around. And in the middle of, like, a pandemic.
Yeah. Whew, it has been a time, and I've also collected probably, 25 plants now?
Yeah.
So, moving 25 plants that I collected during quarantine is not as easy. Or I don't even think it sounds easy. It's actually just, it's quite difficult, actually. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, so we just want to give you a little context about, like, the energy that we're coming into this virtual space with. Definitely a little tired. I'm a little tired. For sure. And too, like, I guess if you want to, like, relate it back to, like, you know, trauma or things like that, that we're going to be talking about today, I think I'm a little, like, grateful that I do have that skill of, like, dissociation. Because I definitely needed it during this time to just keep going, and pack everything up and just get it done. I'm sure I'll crash and, like, rest at some point.
Yeah, for sure. No, Bianca's been a trooper through all this because she just, you know, moving is, I feel like there's no easy way to do it unless you're, like, really rich and can afford, like, just movers to pack and move things for you. But, my amazing boyfriend helped me move. And, like, if it weren't for him, we would not have a sofa to be sitting on because I was, like, incapable of moving and carrying this sofa. So he had help, but major shout out to my boyfriend. And, you know, it's important to have your people in your circle who you support.
Absolutely.
I think that one thing that we kind of talked about was how, like, moving is one of those things where, like, you can't, like, do it on your own. Like, you have to ask for help, and I think that's a skill sometimes a lot of us have a hard time honing in on, is how to release responsibility. That's a really hard thing for me, for sure.
Definitely. No, I was struggling as well with that, like, asking for help. Luckily, you know, Ryan, Ashley's partner, and a friend of ours was able to help us because we would not have done it on our own.
But, you know, we're here, and we did it. But it's definitely been a lot of, I feel like with moving, you know, it's just, the emotional aspects are inevitable because you're packing things up, you're seeing things, you're putting things away. And I know for us it was very surreal. Like, our last home was such a home. And we had, you know, artwork everywhere and plants everywhere. Like, our walls certainly were not empty. So it was just like, while we were taking everything down, it was like, oh my God, like, we didn't even recognize the space, and the energy of the space completely shifted. But, you know, and of course that made me kind of nostalgic because I'm like, wow, I had such great memories here, such great processing happened, such many connections were made. Like, I'm just like, wow, I'm gonna miss this space. But I think for me it's been a little tough having to process and move
at the same
time.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we're gonna do, like, just to close that out. We're gonna go ahead and, like, kind of go through each room in the space and think, just say it with a candle and just say, like, kind of like a little, like, sentence or phrase of gratitude for, like, the memories that we had in those spaces, and just to, like, really close that out in a really healthy way, and then we'll, fully settle into our new
spot, which we love. Like, it's a really great. I called my last space, like, my bachelorette pad, and I'm like, yeah, it was super transformative in me as, like, an individual, and I'm like, wow, I'm moving into this in such a different place, like, emotionally, mentally, so I'm like, wow, I'm very excited to see what the next chapter is. So
absolutely,
that's I hope y'all out there are, checking it. Pause the video. We'll pretend like we're listening, and we'll be like, yes, okay. If you want to check in, think out loud. Just, you can pause the video, take a quick check-in for yourself to see what kind of energy you're bringing as you're receiving this information, because that's also, I think, really important, is not just for us as giving and having this conversation, but also as listeners, where is our emotional space at? Because a part of talking is listening, and so feel free to pause, check in. But thank you again for coming back, for coming here for the first time. This is through the nonprofit organization Babes Only, which is a nonprofit here in Chicago, but we also do events globally and nationally that we focus on empowering women across all fields and aspects. Before the quarantine, we were doing a lot of pop-up physical events, like networking events at kind of Babes Only takeovers at a lot of bars and spaces, trying to cultivate and create a culture in the nightlife that we really want to see, that aligns with our ideas of respecting and empowering women across, all spectrums of the industry, from bartenders to people who make soaps, to DJs, to tarot readers, just trying to bring, create a vision of what we want and what we consider a safe space. So if you want to learn more about us or support us, all of our social medias are Babes Only Fun, at Babes Only Fun on Instagram and Twitter, or feel free to visit us at babesonly.co to learn more about the work we do in some of the events and to see photos. But we did, so this is me and Bianca's second YouTube video now, which is fun because I've never recorded or published YouTube videos. So this is our second one. We had a physical, like a Zoom meeting where we had some participants and basically had a really great conversation. How did you feel about the Zoom meeting?
Yeah, so the Zoom meeting I felt very well. It was, we opened it up to survivors of assault, women or femme-identified survivors of sexual violence. And, we opened it up. I led a breathing
meditation.
Exercise.
Yeah.
I've actually never led a breathing exercise, so that was the first time.
She did great.
It went great, and everyone seemed super relaxed, so I'm happy. And I think it went well just because of, like, how much knowledge was in the space to be contributed. You know what I mean?
For sure.
I think it's super important to have a space where survivors of sexual violence can talk about what their experiences look like, things that do connect them, and things that don't, right? Like things that are similar across experiences of violence that we can call all kinds, as survivors, relate to, and then the things that are just, like, so specific to each experience. And I was really grateful to hear from everyone in the call. Obviously, we're not going to share specifics today about what was shared. That was a private space. But we do kind of want to do a little recap just about
Like some paraphrasing.
some themes that came up
Yeah.
that we felt would be important and beneficial to share for a lot of folks, survivors or not. So
Yeah, one thing that definitely came up that I really would like to start with, since this is a conversation around sexual assault, is like forming, or if you could give us a definition around sexual assault, because I know that's something that came up in the last meeting was, what is the formal definition, and is that enough? Does the formal legal definition really encapsulate the true lived experiences? So, at your organization, how would y'all describe sexual assault?
yeah, definitely and that's something about resilience too that I appreciate, is that we deal with sexual violence, and so we kind of call it like the spectrum of sexual violence, and anything that falls under that, from folks that have experienced assault, whether, and I'm going to get a little bit particular or detailed, but whether there was penetration, of a body part or not, whether there was groping, if it was some kind of like sexual harassment where there were like a lot of like sexual threats or sexual innuendos, even if there was no physical contact, those are all under the spectrum of sexual violence. And resilience, at least, and I think a lot of spaces that work with anti-sexual violence, we recognize that can look so different, and that can still have an impact on people, regardless of what the severity, right, is. And our legal system doesn't really acknowledge all of that. So when we're looking at different laws across the nation, oftentimes those laws don't reflect the experiences that people are having. So you might be like, well, I was groped, or, I was, what can I do? Can I go file a police report? No.
Right.
Depending on the state, I guess, but no, because it doesn't qualify under that law. And that's something, like, really, that can feel so, like, disheartening to someone that has experienced something that doesn't...
You can feel invalidated.
Exactly. And that's definitely something that, even if we're not talking about the legal system, the criminal justice system, I know this came up in our conversation, the Zoom meeting, was just like the way our culture and our society deems what is actual assault and what isn't, and that can feel really disheartening as well when someone doesn't feel like their experience fits the typical survivor experience. You know what I mean? And I know that that's something that kept coming up in the Zoom meeting, as far as, like, is this a thing? You know what I mean?
Like, is what I think so often do a lot of people, because I talked about this in the last video, but I had a moment where I was like, can what I experience be defined as sexual assault? You know what I mean? Like, there's just so, it's very particular, but I think we have really been kind of, conditioned to think of sexual assault and justice and all these other things as very one-dimensional, as very black and white. It's very like, this, there must be this in order for this to happen. And it's not always that easy. And I'm really happy that we are talking about this, and that in the meeting we were able to kind of like validate, people's experiences, and validate like, and also validate that like you don't have to have definitions, or you don't have to process things. There's no timeline. There's no right timeline to say like, you should be healed and know what to do and know how you want justice to be served a week after your experience, or a year after your experience, or it's been 10 years. Why are you now talking? No, I feel like that's just not a good attitude to have around it, because everyone is so different. Things aren't black and white.
And there's such like a pressure, like you said, to like process or just analyze your experience and label it immediately, when, I mean, that's not how trauma works.
Right.
That's not how feelings work, and I just wish that there was more space to just kind of allow people to sit in their feelings, you know, and to experience whatever it is that they're experiencing without, like, defining it and being like, okay, well, this is what this is, so this is what we have to do, and it's like, you know, when people come to the center, at least, like, they might not say, I experienced assault, or I experienced rape, or I experienced whatever. They'll just say, this happened, and it didn't feel right. Mm-hmm. And this is how I'm feeling. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that's it. And we roll with it, because you can do that. And then maybe, who knows, a year from now, they start, like, being like, yes, I am a survivor, I experienced this assault, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's totally fine. Like, allowing people the time and the space to, like you said, like, just go through that process.
Mm-hmm.
That is wild. And also especially because when people experience trauma, they literally, at least when they're in the acute trauma phase, like, they literally are having, like, hormones being pumped into their system. They have experienced memory loss, jumbling of memories, having different, like, reactions as far, like, physical reactions, like, maybe they might be just, like, laughing a little, or they're just crying, and then suddenly they're sleeping. There's so many different reactions, and it's like, how can you expect someone, while that's happening, to fully, like,
conceptualize and absolutely. And it's also like, you know, everyone is so different. Everyone's life experience is so personal. Like, we don't know people's very specific triggers or traumas, or also, like, if someone's sexually assaulted and they still have to take care of their kids and go to work, and, like, they have to just kind of compartmentalize that. And I feel like that's what happens so often, is because we do live in a world where it's very go, go, go. Like, you have to stay on top of your schoolwork, stay on top of your actual, you know, professional work, or you have to raise your family, you have to support your family in some way, and it can, I think it's important
you have to move.
Yeah.
And we're talking about moving we're just moving spaces, and that's it. But sometimes survivors have to move because of an assault or something. Imagine moving with that stress.
Exactly. So that, you know, that can absolutely prolong someone's experience. And I think can also change or have an impact on people's relationship towards their experience, towards their assault. And I think we have to consider all these factors, which is why I think it's just like, no, these things aren't black and white. And I think we need to stop having that attitude around it, and, like, you know, allowing that space. And I think another thing that we also kind of brought up in the Zoom meeting was, you know, okay, maybe it does take you a while, but you have finally you decided to disclose publicly, or, you know,
to your group of friends, loved ones, whatever.
Yeah, your family, your loved ones, your classroom, your social media, whatever the case is. You've decided to share your story, and, you know, that, I think that step right there is already something very important and to process, and can be a very re-triggering experience. But something that we brought up was, like, when people do decide to share their experience, you know, I feel like I can relate to this as far as, like, you know, family. It's like suddenly you become kind of like the spokesperson for sexual assault.
Yes.
And it's like, we just finished explaining that looks so many different ways, and, like, people, like you were saying, like, people see something on TV and are like, oh, can you, like, explain to me, or can you talk to me, can we talk about this? And it's like, you know, I feel like we can't assume we're entitled to people's stories, experience, knowledge.
Exactly. And this happens, and what we're talking about that came up in the Zoom meeting, we also talked about how this happens with many different kinds of trauma, right? So when we talk about, like, emotional labor on femmes, right? Like, femme labor, like, we talk about that, right? And that comes from trauma as a femme, or if you're a woman, you know, female-identified person, you might experience sexism, you might experience trauma, or if you're a person of color, you might experience racism, and you have these traumas, and you have to cope, and you have to survive those things, and then people who don't have those traumas want to learn about it.
Yeah.
With good intentions, right? But it's kind of like makes you have to disclose a lot more times, a lot more details, and often when folks are asking about those things, they don't really consider the people who are experiencing the trauma, their feelings, or like, do they have the energy for this?
Mm-hmm.
Where's their headspace?
Yeah.
Is this too invasive? Also, again, just like sexual violence, with any other kind of trauma or violence, like racial violence, homophobia, transphobia, folks are still processing.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, people don't always have the energy to explain that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think like what you said, as far as like, there's there could be many different like layers of oppression happening. And like one thing that was talked about in the Zoom meeting was like, like if you're an activist, like maybe you're fighting for several different, you're fighting for from an intersectional perspective, and there's many things you're focusing on in your activism, but you're only being asked to speak about like your sexual assault because because you disclosed it. So now people think, oh, that's the only thing that's your priority. When it's like, no, we can't assume that like all of these things exist at the same time.
Yes, exactly, and that's like a term called like complex trauma. You know what I mean? So like when you have multiple traumas that compound each other and they do interact with each other, and often I've heard a lot of survivors who are seeking therapy at the center that they have tried therapy elsewhere, but that they only let them talk about the sexual violence, and that they were it's like very weird about like, we're here to talk about the sexual violence, we're not here to talk about,
anything, yeah.
If you're
like the racism you experience at work or the transphobia you experience at work, can't be shared in space when it's like it all absolutely
but it all
ties
really ties together. Exactly. And it's gonna and that's when we were saying like how every experience is so unique.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, because we are such multi-dimensional people, and we have such different identities that we're experiencing, and also just different life experiences. You know what I mean?
Right.
So you can't really see someone that went through an experience of sexual violence and they're telling you about that specific experience, because you also don't know what else they've experienced, other stuff. You can't really like look at them and say this is how they should be reacting to this experience. This is how I think that I would have reacted. Mm-hmm. Well, you're not them.
You're not in their exact. Exactly. You're not in their exact specific. Yes, exactly. Shoes.
So.
Yeah. Oh no! Planting greens.
Yes.
And I think so. Like you mentioned, I really like how you use the term like complex trauma and how all of this can be very complex. So, how would you say? Like, let's talk about like, okay, now someone has disclosed to you, and maybe you do have questions, or maybe you have curiosities, or maybe you want to like see if this person would be, willing to talk at your event, or whatever the case is. What are appropriate responses? Like, genuinely, because I feel like we know some of the ones that we see on Twitter that are like, I believe you, I believe you, I believe you. But like, what does that mean? But also more specifically, what does that look like in action? Because I'm a very action-oriented person. I'm like, okay, yes, I hear these things, but what does truly believing someone look like?
Yeah, no, definitely. Because you can say, like, the typical, I believe you, it's not your fault, and you have options, right? That's kind of like, but there are so many ways to show people that you believe them and that you're not blaming them, right?
Yeah.
Well, it comes into also asking them questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if they're telling you about their assault and you are like, oh, I wouldn't do that. Like,
right.
Wait, why did you do that? I would be careful, like, if someone's telling you their experience, to question them too much about, like, why they responded
Yeah.
in the way they responded. Because the point is that they experienced a trauma. Clearly, this is,
Yeah.
they're in distress. So, harm happened. So they did something, right now, we're not worried about why they responded.
Right now, there's an emotional processing
we
happening.
have to sit in that moment first, you know what I mean?
And we had this conversation, like me and Bianca talked about, like, something, if you're femme identifying, something you've probably experienced, we literally experienced this today in the car, is like catcalling. Like, is this idea.
We experienced reverse catcalling.
Yeah, we were in the car and these men were in the street yelling at us. I'm like, how does that, like, truly, what goes through your brain? Like, you think we're going to stop the car, park it, pull over, and, like, get out? Like, what is your end game here? Like, but, I feel like, like I said, if you're femme identifying or femme presenting, you're going to have to deal with sexual street or, like, harassment in public at some point. And it's, it's very interesting because me and Bianca had a conversation and how we both, like, we were talking about kind of like the intricacies of that, where, like, sometimes you might want to just keep your headphones in and keep it pushing, or you want to yell back and curse them out or tell them about themselves. And it's like, those two things, yeah, they're very different. And I don't think there is a wrong or right way when we're talking about people and how they feel they want to respond in that moment too, especially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh my gosh, like, everyone has the right to respond how they're going to respond, right? Like, they have a reaction. And I think we need to also think about, like, why. Like, I know I said don't ask them why they're they're responding, but, we all know, in a sense, why anyone is responding. Mm-hmm. The main point that why people are responding to sexual violence is simply a way for them to stay safe. Mm-hmm. I feel a way for them to stay safe and a way for them to reclaim agency over themselves and their bodies. Mm-hmm. That's, like, the two things that, like, I feel survivors of trauma are seeking to reestablish, is reestablish and get that balance back of, like, safety and then agency. So, if you think about it that way, then really anything that someone does when they're responding to violence is going to be valid in a sense, as long as they're not harming someone else.
Right.
So if someone wants to, keep walking when they're being catcalled and not say anything and just, like, keep their headphones and just put their blinders on and just keep walking, that is their way that they felt the safest in that situation when they were being harassed.
Exactly.
And it's the way that they felt empowered. Because they're like, this is how I reclaim my agency in that moment, because I keep walking and I don't care about them. But someone else might not feel that way. Someone else might feel safer if they point it out and they're like, I'm calling you on your shit, nasty man. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And they feel like I said something, so that makes me safer because I show that I can stand up for myself, and it also, I'm standing up for myself. So therefore, that makes me feel more empowered and like I still have agency over my body. And both can be true, and both can be just as valid.
And it's like, it's also so situational. Again, things aren't black and white. Like, maybe in one instance you do feel comfortable and confident yelling something back, and maybe that's the next day you feel safer just keeping your headphones in and keeping it moving. Like, and I think one thing that's important to think about too in regards to talking about this is, like, if someone's sharing an experience with you, or if someone's like, oh yeah, today, like, I got catcalled at the store or whatever, I think something that's important is, like, taking yourself out of that situation and, like, well, I would have said something. I would have just kept it quiet.
Why'd you say something? Like, just keep walking. Like, you're just gonna make it worse. Like, and it's like, okay.
And it's like, well, like, maybe if that's how you feel, like, maybe that's very valid, but also, like, that's what they decided to do. So that's all you can do in supporting them. It's like, we are all experts in ourselves, and, like, I can't sit here and tell Bianca, like, how she should have responded to someone, because it's like, well, she did what she felt was best, and like we deserve to give people that agency, because it's like, just because I also experienced catcalling and this is how I deal with it doesn't mean I can project that onto anyone else.
Exactly. And that goes for other forms of sexual violence as well. You know what I mean? Like when people are experiencing, other kinds of sexual violence that they disclose, we have to just trust that they're the experts in their own experience and that they did what they had to do to keep themselves safe in the moment, and that they, there are things that they might need to reestablish agency and to feel empowered again, and that, within limits. And I say within limits because I feel like your right to express yourself and feel and, have agency and power, your rights to that, anyone's rights to that, end where someone else's boundaries begin. So I say within limits of that we're not harming other people, right? So
for sure.
But if we're not, then okay, it's valid. Like however you responded.
And I think it's also important to validate like how someone responds, even if it's not how you would have responded. In that, like, if someone, like we talked about, someone got like groped at the club or something, and they're really upset about it and wanna like say something, or they go home later and they start crying about it, like it's important to validate that, even if it's something you would have just like brushed off, or like, oh, they just catcalled you, like that's not that big of a deal. Why are you crying? Like, well, again, everyone's experiences with assault and sexual violence is different, and that's okay, and that's important, I think, to truly validate. I think, again, like I said, like taking yourself out of that situation a little bit and just giving this person complete and total respect and agency for how they responded to something, like that's really important, because maybe something's not a big deal to you, or maybe you're able to keep that pushing after something happens, but that doesn't mean we can expect that from everyone else. And I think that's unfair to expect that, you know what I mean? And like if you're like, I don't know, also it's like, I know for me sometimes I have very delayed processing, or like I can like process things a lot later. So like if someone, like maybe I'm going to be upset about something in 6 months after it happened, versus someone who's going to be upset about it, later that night. They're gonna process that, and that turnaround is a lot quicker. Like everyone just processes these things so differently, so we can't project how our brain works onto anyone else.
Exactly. And all of that, it has to do with, everyone's life experiences, everyone's different identities that they are grappling with, and the different experiences. They might have experienced other kinds of trauma right before that are going to play into how they're responding to a new trauma, right? Everything is kind of like, just like our healing isn't linear. I've heard that term thrown around a lot. Healing is not linear. It's kind of, you know what I mean? It comes back and it spirals. That's how our life experiences are too, and our trauma is not linear. So,
yes,
when we're experiencing new trauma, it all kind of it all compounds, and it all kind of comes into mixing in and amplifying different responses to trauma, or different experiences of trauma as well. Maybe that person that got groped at the club and they're crying, maybe they were assaulted 4 months ago. And we don't know that. And that experience of being groped at the club, which is awful and not okay, just in and of itself, but maybe that's also bringing up, it's triggering.
It's like amplifying
the experiences from before, you know what I mean? And so for someone else to invalidate that, not only invalidates that experience, but it invalidates their assault experience, right? And it's so harmful. So we have to be so fucking careful.
Because we never know how someone's connecting something. And also, like, we may never know. Like, it's, they may never, that person who got groped may never disclose to me or anyone that they were assaulted recently. So it's like, if I were to just be like, oh, look, it wasn't that big of a deal. Like, you're fine. It's like, I'm, like you said, invalidating the experience that this is reminding them of, the root, the emotional aspect of that.
Mm-hmm. And that also reminds me of, like, I think we talked a little bit about different triggers and different things in the Zoom meeting, different things that can trigger you, right? And, like, how invalidating it can be, especially when the trigger isn't even related to sexual assault. So perhaps someone, has trauma and is a survivor of some form of sexual violence, and they go to the store, and, like, someone, I can think of, like, an example, like, someone goes to the store and they're, like, about to grab something off the shelf, and they're, like, grabbing it, and someone else does some weird stuff and, like, grabs it out of their hands or something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And invades their space, gets really close, and kind of just, like, grabs it out, and they're like, that's very weird and rude. But some people might just be like, okay, that was a rude ass man, or rude ass man that, like, did that. Cut in front of me and, like, took that item, but whatever. But if someone is struggling and coping with trauma, that instance that is not even a sexual instance can trigger taking away your agency. You know what I mean? Like, the act of literally invading your space, taking something out of your hands, even though it wasn't a sexual, like, act, it can trigger the responses. It can remind you of what you were feeling when your agency was taken away during an assault, right? Yeah. And then someone might be freaking out in a grocery store and saying, this man did this, and then you're like, okay, like, that's rude, but, like, why are you freaking out? We gotta trust sometimes that, or we should probably trust all the time, that when people are feeling something, they're just feeling it, and that we can trust that they're feeling it for a reason. And maybe they don't know why at that moment. They don't even know.
Right.
But they are feeling it for a reason, and you can just validate that.
And, everyone's experiences are so personal, and I think that kind of ties into, like, when we talk about, like, how personal justice can look like, and how personal, like, what someone may need to, like, get closure or to feel like justice has been served. Like, I think another thing people project is, like, or, like, we are so conditioned to think, like, justice for survivors automatically means jail, or it means some form of incarceration. Yeah. And, like, I think that doesn't truly represent, it doesn't represent, like, very few cases of sexual assault actually are prosecuted, and, the sexual assault is not as glamorous as SVU, where, like, they always get thrown in jail, and there's this, like, there's this, like, happy ending where, I finally feel safe. Like, they're so often, and also, it's not that black and white, because, it's not just random strangers who are sexually assaulting survivors, right? Like, it can be very personal to family members or partners or coworkers, or, the relationship between the two parties can be very specific, and it's like, I think we need to be more understanding, or allow space for survivors to say, like, I don't want this person to go to jail. I don't want this person, or maybe they don't want that person to be fired, or maybe they don't want that person. Like, we need to allow space for survivors to, really assess how they want justice to be served, because maybe, like, everything's so personal. So, and I think survivors need and deserve more agency over how they want to continue.
Absolutely. That's a super, super great point, because, the criminal justice system serves up, like, cookie cutter justice, right? And justice is, they don't really serve up justice very often. Or at all, I'd say. But I always talk about it as in, like, there are survivors who don't want to go through the criminal justice system because they don't feel that aligns with their values. They understand that the CRJ system is harmful to certain Black and brown communities, trans, queer communities, and they don't want to be a part of that. And so there's that. But even for survivors who do want to rely on the criminal justice system for justice, they rarely get that. So the criminal justice system rarely even serves up or results in the outcome that they set out to, to have, right? Because I think, only about 3% of all sexual assaults end up with like a prosecution or something, right? Which is also like, even if they were to end up with a prosecution, is that even what we want to be doing to solve this problem? Is that really going to prevent sexual violence? No, that can be argued. And while folks are going through that system, they are also going through these structured processes, right? That are very, anything that fits under whatever in that state, whatever sexual assault is defined as legally in that state, they're just going to go through that process, that they're going to file the report, they're going to do their investigation, get the evidence to show that it fits this little legal definition, and then they go to jail, right? Like, there's really no personalization of what happens, even though everyone's experience is so different and everyone's needs are so different. That system is very cookie cutter in that everyone is going to get the same thing dished out to them, right? And so in the Zoom meeting, that's how all of us together, we were talking about this and came up with, the personalization of justice. Yeah. And how we really do need to do things that look at the intricacies of each person's experience. And that is what restorative and transformative justice aim to do, is to look at each person in their own context and figure out what they need. Yeah. And I'm glad that you just mentioned about focusing on the survivor's agency, because that's so important to their healing. Yeah. And so when we're looking at really making sure that their needs and the way they want to respond to that assault is being respected, we are facilitating healing, because we're giving back agency in a way that the criminal justice system continues to traumatize survivors and take away their agency. They can't even, they're not even in charge of whether the case is prosecuted or not, right?
Like someone else gets to decide if their case is worthy or, worth being prosecuted. And I think, it can be hard, kind of like what you mentioned about transformative justice. Yes, that's what transformative and restorative justice aims to do, and it can be hard, I think, for a survivor, and this is kind of brought up in the Zoom meeting, to imagine what that even looks like for themselves, because we're so used to just one idea of what that looks like. And I don't know, I am fully in favor of encouraging people. Again, this is so personal to you, and I'm fully in favor of people doing what they feel is best, whether it's not waiting. I guess what I'm trying to say is not waiting for someone else to tell you this is what's gonna make you feel better. Yes. Trusting and listening to yourself, as far as is talking to this person gonna make you feel better? Is talking to this person with a mediator, a close friend, a mutual friend there gonna make you feel better? Is a letter that they have to write me, or agreements around if it's someone who's in your social group, and agreements around making sure there's a time period where you don't want to see this person at social events, whatever the case is, really imagining what feels right for you, but trusting that, trusting yourself and trusting, other people. If someone's oh yeah, I want someone to, write me a letter and I don't know, something write and donate money to this sexual assault organization. Whatever the case is, if that's what you feel is going to be right, then, in a way I say go for it. But also, it's okay. And I think this is something that the justice system doesn't consider either. Is like processing as time goes. In that, like, okay, maybe this person wrote you a letter and it provided some closure for a bit, but then something happened and you're feeling re-triggered or it's being brought back up, and maybe you want to talk with them this time, or maybe you want to talk to some of their friends this time. Like, I don't know, I feel like we should be allowing space for that process as well, because it's truly what it is, a process.
Absolutely, yeah. Like we said, healing is not linear, and so, how can we expect that a survivor is, like, when they just experience the assault, that they're going to be able to make, and not saying because they're not capable, I'm just saying, like, how can we, like, pressure them to make those decisions about how they want to respond so soon after the assault? It's like, give them time if they need it, right? If they don't, fine. But if they do, give them that time, and give them that time to, like, go back and forth, like you said. Like, that might have been fine at that time, but then you kind of, like, process more, and you're like, wait, that isn't fine, actually. You know what I mean? Like, I need more, because now I have complex PTSD, and I know that this person that harmed me is wealthy, okay, and so now I'd like them to pay for my therapy, because of what they cost, even if it was a year after it happened. You know what I mean? Like, it gives that space to, like, let people grow and go through that process of healing and whatever it is that they're going to need every step of the way. I think that's so important that you brought that up. For sure.
Yeah, and I think that, like, often, like, the criminal justice system just expects, like, survivors to just kind of, like, move on once, like, justice has been served. Once they're in jail, like, okay, now you can move on. And it's like, moving on is such a process. Like, this idea, this concept of moving on, like, because I feel like I've seen some arguments around some arguments against transformative justice being like, well, like, so the person who caused harm is just never going to get to move on from this. And it's like, well, people who experience trauma, it's something they have to kind of work with for kind of the rest of their lives, essentially, like, in a perfect world, yes, you can just flip a switch and, like, turn that trauma off, like, wow, this person is out of my life now, so I will never have to think about that again. And it's just like, no, I think there need, both parties deserve to, continue their life and heal, right? But I think it's just not realistic to think that this one-time thing is going to provide all the closure necessary, and that we should be open, and, individuals who've caused harm should especially be open and accepting to this idea that it's going to take a process, and, like, because I know with me, like, with friends, I've talked about this where it's like, maybe someone caused harm, them and that individual have had a conversation, and the survivor is on social media kind of, like, bringing it back up or, like, sharing it again, and I had a conversation with a friend who was like, well, like, he already talked to her, so, like, what should be happening now? Like, what? And I'm just like, maybe, like, nothing. Like, maybe she doesn't need to talk to him. Like, maybe she just feels like sharing her story. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, it's just like, we should be allowing space. Just because someone has a mediation with someone doesn't mean okay, that's it. You never bring it up again. It's like, that's not how that works. We don't get to decide when people choose to tell their stories or not. Maybe someone's fully healed and they still feel like sharing their story. Like, maybe they have no qualms with this person. They just want to share their story or their experience or whatever the case is. And, like, that should definitely be allowed.
Absolutely. Just, like, allowing that process of healing. And as these new revelations about your experience are coming up, that's allowed. It's allowed to bring that up, So, and that definitely came up as well in the Zoom meeting and I think there was a moment where it was kind of brought into like intersectionality between sexual violence and also other identities, like for example being queer. So when you're in the LGBTQ plus like umbrella, there's this concept of like continuously having to come out and continuously having to like with new people or new spaces or whatever to be like, oh, that moment where it's like I'm queer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And are they gonna like, how are they gonna react to that? And that happens with survivors of violence, no matter who you are. It's like it can happen where you might have to disclose, right? Whether it's at the doctor or with like a new partner, a new romantic or sexual partner,
new friends
that you're getting closer to, and then like you have a moment where you might need to disclose or you might want to disclose, and so it's this continuous thing of it keeps getting brought up. It's going to keep getting brought up for the survivor, right? It's going to keep having to come up, whether you're disclosing or whether you're just like experience a trigger randomly at the grocery store, right? Like, and you're like, oh shit, that happened 4 years ago, but here I am having a panic attack at the grocery store because someone invaded my space, and now they're having to process that. Now something else is, coming up, and so when people think about like criminal justice system and like, oh, we put that person in jail, it's over. No, it's not over.
No. And I think that's like to kind of like bring it all back together. Like I think like with these conversations, we really do hope to kind of push a conversation around like thinking bigger, like outside of like these black and white definitions of sexual assault. Because I think people, when they hear the word sexual assault, there's like maybe one image, this media image of what that looks like comes to mind. And like with these conversations, we hope to kind of create engaging dialogue, or at least thought around like that sexual assault could look many different ways, but so can like the justice, and so can the process, and so can the healing. Our goal, I feel like, is to encourage healing, but like healing in all its forms and aspects, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, and hopefully, like we said, so many, just an awesome conversation I felt happened.
It was so
meeting,
amazing, empowering, and these were all people who had never like met each other before.
I know.
They weren't even all in Chicago. Like it was an amazing Zoom meeting of people in different spaces, and it was so great to have like just a confidential space for people to talk, and it was so nice.
Yeah, and create knowledge.
Yeah,
right? Like create knowledge, like because I think there's like support groups, and that has its place. Therapy and support groups and healing circles, like those things definitely have their place. But what we're talking about now, and I guess what's being facilitated with these spaces, these support lines, is supporting each other, and also like building a framework and analysis, building new knowledge around our collective experience as survivors, right? And I think that's super important to do in general, is to like be able to come up with that analysis, right? And that space is not really provided for survivors of sexual violence. Like we're often told, people are taught about that by SVU and by our criminal justice system and by all these like weird rape myths and things that exist in our communities, you know what I mean? And that's where we learn about what sexual violence is, or through just only our own experience, with no guidance sometimes, and a lot of folks without any kind of like supportive people around them to talk about those things with. So hopefully, this will bring out just like more information, more knowledge that's helpful to folks in healing and creating spaces that are safer for survivors.
Definitely. And so this is really just me and Bianca here right now. But
Yeah.
we do plan to do another Zoom meeting, which we hope, more people can attend virtually, and it's really nice. The Zoom meetings, like I said, there were people that weren't even based in Chicago, so it's cool that we have the opportunity to do something like this and reach people in different spaces and places, because like you said, like sometimes people, the only knowledge they have around this is their own experience, and like their own experience can be influenced by a number of things, including where you are geographically. Like if you're in a rural area versus a major city, you may have a different experience with resources or processing and things like that. So, this is our second video, and we plan to have our second Zoom meeting sometime in September. So please stay tuned for that. If you want to support and follow the Babes Only page, that is at Babes Only Fun on Instagram and Twitter. My personal Instagram and Twitter is at _MO_MAMI, so _Mo_Mami.
Yes, and my handles are for both IG and Twitter are at Bodacious Bruja. That's Bodacious, and then BRUJA. So you want spiritual stuff, you need a book of tarot reading, you need a book of DJ.
Whatever you need. But thank y'all for tuning in with us. If anything, if you have any questions, if anything kind of sparked your interest, or you want to learn more about something, feel free to comment below in the comments or reach out to us on social media. But that's it for me.
Yay!
Have a good day, y'all.